Welcome to lesson number 2 in basic business grammar skills. In this lesson, we're going to cover basic sentence structure. The most basic complete sentence is composed of two parts, the subject and the predicate. The subject is the topic or the main idea of the sentence and usually contains a noun. The predicate explains something about the subject. It may contain a verb or an adjective. Well, let's go ahead and look at some examples. Well, here's a very basic, simple sentence. Joe hit the ball. So in this case, Joe is the subject. Hit the ball is the predicate. So the subject is who or what, and the predicate is what's happening. In this case, hit the ball. Well, here's another very simple sentence example. Joe has red hair. Again, subject and predicate. Joe being the subject, has red hair is the predicate. Well, we're going to get a little bit more complex as we go, but that's the very basic structure of a sentence, subject and predicate. Well, as we move up the line, Joe hit the ball. Yes, that's a great start in English, but of course we are going to have much more complex sentence structure as we work with English, especially in a business setting. So as we're moving up, let's talk about a compound sentence. A compound sentence is going to have more than one subject and or more than one predicate. Again, a compound sentence. So let's go ahead and look at a couple of examples of compound sentences. Okay, here is an example of a simple compound sentence. Joe and Sue drove to the park. Now, in this case, we have a compound subject. Joe and Sue, two subjects in this case, and just a simple non-compound predicate, drove to the park. All right, continuing on with compound sentences, here we have an example of a compound predicate. Joe, simple subject, drove to the park and ate lunch there. Again, a compound predicate, two things are happening. All right, we've discussed compound sentences. Let's go a little bit further and we'll get into a complex sentence that has an independent and a dependent clause. Well, what is a clause? Well, it's not Santa Claus. Clauses are included in sentences, and clauses have subjects and predicates. So in a complex sentence, you're going to end up with a clause that has a subject and a predicate, and another clause that has a subject and a predicate. So in a sense, it's almost like combining two sentences together, but that's not exactly what you get. So hang on, let's go ahead and look at some examples of complex sentences here. All right, let's look at this example. Joe went to the park riding in his red convertible. So this sentence technically has two subjects and two predicates. Joe went to the park and riding in his red convertible. Well, let's go ahead and see how this works, because we're going to learn a little bit more about clauses. We're going to learn about independent and dependent clauses here in the next slide. So hang on just a second and we'll understand this just a little bit better. But this is a complex sentence with two different clauses. All right, I mentioned independent and dependent clauses. Now let's spend some time learning the difference between the two. An independent clause is a clause or a part of the sentence that can stand alone as a sentence. It's a complete sentence. It's a complete thought. So in that example that we just had, Joe went to the park riding in his red convertible. Joe went to the park can stand alone. We can put a period right there, and that's a complete sentence. So if it's a complete sentence by itself, then it would be considered an independent clause. Doesn't need anything else. It's independent of anything else. Independent clause, complete sentence. Now in that complex sentence that we had, Joe went to the park riding in his red convertible. Riding in his red convertible is a dependent clause. If we just simply have that as it is, riding in his red convertible, it makes no sense. It doesn't stand alone as a sentence because we're asking ourselves, who is he? Who's riding in the convertible? So in this case, this clause only makes sense when it is combined with the other clause, Joe went to the park. So this is dependent on the other clause. So this is a dependent clause. All right, let's do a quick review and see if we were paying attention here. Which of the following is an example of a sentence with a compound predicate? Number one, Joe ignored the signs and got a speeding ticket. Number two, Joe and Betty drove through the town very fast. Number three, Marvin and his bright blue hair were visible for miles. Well, think about it here. Which one do you think it is? We'll show you the next slide. Well, if you chose Joe ignored the signs and got a speeding ticket, then you are correct. So in this example, the subject of the sentence is Joe. And the sentence has a compound predicate. Ignored the signs and got a speeding ticket. All right, here's another chance to prove how brilliant you are and that you were paying attention. So look at these two examples from this sentence and figure out which one is the independent clause. Wondering what he would have for dinner, Joe surveyed the road for fast food signs. Is the independent clause wondering what he would have for dinner? Or is it Joe surveyed the road for fast food signs? And of course, I'll give you a little hint. Remember that an independent clause can stand on its own as a complete sentence. So think about it. Which one do you think it is? And I'll show you in the next slide. Of course, I know that you picked Joe surveyed the road for fast food signs. That is the independent clause because it can stand alone as a complete sentence. It has a subject and a predicate, and it makes perfect sense by itself. Remember, the other clause, the dependent clause, is dependent upon this particular clause in order to make sense. So good job again. All right, let's do a quick review of this whole lesson. Remember that a basic sentence has a subject and a predicate. A compound sentence may have a compound subject and or a compound predicate. Remember that the subject is who or what, the topic of the sentence, and the predicate describes it. A complex sentence has both an independent and a dependent clause. Remember that an independent clause can stand alone as a complete sentence and a complete thought. A dependent clause cannot stand alone. It doesn't make any sense by itself. It needs the independent clause to help it make sense. All right, if you like this video, please consider liking, please consider subscribing. I will have or do have the text to this lesson out of my website, luthermaddie.com. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next grammar lesson or some other lesson.